All right, now that we've looked at formulating policies and then also how we actually go about legitimating them within the public, it's important to look at the actual piece of implementation and how within public organizations we work to assure that policies are being put into practice in a meaningful manner, in a meaningful way. The fact of the matter is that after a law is passed, we still don't have what we may consider to be a workable piece of legislation. What Congress, what a state legislature, what a city council says they want bureaucracy to do in creating the program, and what's actually feasible or likely, are very often two different things. And as a result, it's important that we put time and effort into figuring out how to best implement it, especially if we want it to be effective and efficient. The traditional view is that the legislature makes policy, and then the administrators simply follow the legislator's lead. And that's fine and dandy, assuming that it's readable and understandable. But if you consider something like the Affordable Care Act, which is this, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of page document, you realize very quickly that it's hard to tell exactly what they're asking for and exactly what it means. Now, within organizational implementation, there are typically two divides we have to be concerned with. The first being a horizontal divide between numbers of sub-governments. Basically looking at the fact that even within the federal government, you have multiple agencies, multiple organizations. Within the state government, you have the same. Within the local government, you have the same. And then there's a vertical divide where you're actually looking at federal government, state government, local government. And with both of these divides, you have to kind of figure out who's best suited to actually go through and implement some piece of policy. What makes it difficult, again, going back to what we talked about a couple of chapters ago, we don't have a single organizational format for accomplishing work in the United States. And as a result, we have a very difficult time coordinating central policy. Different organizations at different levels are shaped differently or designed differently. And once that happens, it becomes increasingly difficult to figure out who should be doing what or who's best suited to do what. We almost have this kind of incoherence, but at the same time, this idea fits the American ideals. We don't want just the one size fits all. We want there to be freedom and opportunity and different structures and the chance for government bodies to kind of determine themselves what works, what doesn't work, how it works best. Kinds of organizations, and this is table 6.1, where you look and see, even at the federal level, what are the 8 different types of organizations we see existing in government. The first is obviously executive departments. There are 15 of them. The head of the executive department is typically a secretary who is a member of the president's cabinet, is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. These are groups like the Department of State, Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, Department of Commerce, Department of the Interior, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, yada, 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 yada. And you see huge numbers here in terms of employment. At the end of the day, they're not necessarily the most important organizations in government, at least not from a presidential standpoint. The second type of organization we have is the Executive Office of the President, which exists to help the President in carrying out their tasks of control and coordination over all of the bureaucracy and all of the executive branch of government as a whole. And you're looking at groups like the Office of Management and Budget, Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, the White House Office. So you see economic manager roles, foreign and defense issues, the everyday complexities of serving the president. I mean, the White House office is personal staff. It could be the person who answers the phone, the person who schedules meetings, all of these groups. Then we have legislative organizations which work to assist Congress. And this includes the General Accountability Office, the Congressional Budget Office, Congressional Research Services. So you basically have organizations that are looking to make sure things get done in an efficient, effective manner. And then you have things like the Congressional Research Service, which exists within the Library of Congress, and their basic role is to do policy research and give individual members of Congress information that they've requested about some particular issue. Then we have independent executive agencies. executive functions, but they're independent of the executive department as a whole. They tend to report directly to the president. You have groups like NASA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Small Business Administration, and basically you look at EPA and SBA, and they exist on their own to sort of recognize the importance of the interest groups that support them. It gives and shows that environmental groups have made it clear that they need, not special privileges, but they need some concentrated attention. We have independent regulatory commissions, Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communication Commission, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. These organizations are outside of government as a whole. They are independent so that the individuals appointed to serve on these groups are able to make the best decisions possible without facing outside pressures that are unnecessary. And again, the members appointed to these boards are appointed by the president and confirmed, but they are not your typical presidential appointees because they can't be removed. So once they're in for whatever their term may be, 3, 5, 7 years, depending on exactly where we're at or where we're looking at. We have foundations: National Science Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities. They basically separate the organization from the remainder of government due to there being some fear of creating this national orthodoxy, which would stifle creativity. So we have it separate. Now, these organizations tend to get a bad rap within the public because we see money going to them, and it's hard to justify to some people. I've personally received NSF funding for political science research, and people argue all the time, is it worth giving Miller $100,000 to study American attitudes towards government when we could be giving that money to citizens in need from the American government? We have public corporations, the most known being the United States Postal Service and the Tennessee Valley Authority. And again, it's unique because the United States uses so much contracting. You'd wonder, why do they then allow for these public corporations, which typically are viewed as financial drains but serve some important service? We also have what we call quasi-governmental groups and organizations that fall under public corporations. And these are things like National Railroad Passenger Corporation, which we refer to as Amtrak, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, or the Federal Reserve Board. And they have attributes of public organizations, but at the same time, at least some amount of their boards of directors are appointed by private sector organizations. With the Federal Reserve Boards, it's banks that get to appoint some. With Amtrak, it's railroad companies. With CPB, it's other media networks who have some role on what's going on. Sorry, I actually have my screensaver on, so this is going to keep blacking out on us for some reason when I don't touch it for a few minutes. And you also have groups like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, organizations that just don't fit nicely anywhere. And then lastly, we have the infamous catch-all category of other organizations. Groups like the Administrative Office of the United States Court, the Smithsonian Institute, the American Red Cross, the National Academy of Science, the Office of Government Ethics. Organizations that function within the federal government but just don't fit any of the other categories very well. There are multiple facets to the system. First of all, redundancy is built in. If we consider the fact that both Congress and the President, through the CBO and OMB, have organizations that are already dealing with budgeting, we know that redundancy exists, and we know it's not efficient, but we also know that neither body is going to be willing to have their group moved out of that picture. Second, we know that some units in the Executive Office of the President duplicate other executive departments. We have a Department of Defense, we have a Department of State, we have a National Security Council. They're doing largely the same thing. They're just coming at it from different angles with different backgrounds and different ultimate goals. And we also know that there are just, in general, variations in the publicness of organizations. Privatization, contracting. Some organizations are far more truly public than others. And if you look at Bush, when George W. Bush first came into office, he had this big push for faith-based organizations where he was going to give federal money to church-based groups to provide some social services, which again, Obama has basically continued. But that's a dramatic difference for the federal government. Implementation issues. What makes it hard to implement good policy? First, we have the basic legislation. It may be too complex. It may be too narrow. It may be too broad. It may be contradictory. It may be redundant. It may be a lot of things. It may be something the legislature didn't really believe in. They just kind of passed it to pass something. It may be policy issues. Legislators oftentimes decide that they're going to go in and pass a law on something that they just don't know that much about. And when that happens, it's hard to actually implement the policy. When they don't know what they're doing, you tend to see responses involve some amount of overkill. Again, if we don't understand what the process is, we don't understand causation, we don't have good information like we talked about in the last chapter, the policy we create is not going to be great. If you look at the quote from Daniel Monahan talking about the way that we've gone and created wars, especially in the 1960s, the war on poverty, he openly says, this is the essential fact. The government did not know what it was doing. It had a theory, or rather a set of theories, nothing more. It was shooting blind. We could also say the same thing about Vietnam, where we went in and didn't necessarily know what we were doing, what we were going to do. And as a result, when you do that, if you're just throwing out ideas and theories, it's hard to make sure you have a policy that ultimately fulfills whatever goals you have set for yourself. The political setting can make it difficult to implement policy. Compromises become a burden for implementation. We've compromised, we negotiated, and then all of a sudden you have a 1,000-page bill that's been drafted quickly and is trying to do 3,000 things for 3,000 different people, and that's hard. That's very difficult to work through and figure out. And then lastly, it's coalitions. You may have to form coalitions, and when you form coalitions, different groups' interests get pushed into the same piece of legislation. And when that happens, you may lose meaning. When you lose meaning, you're relying on bureaucrats to be able to interpret what you actually meant, and that's not something that they're always perfectly capable of doing. And then lastly, we have interest group liberalism. Interest group liberalism is Ted Lowy's main concern, where he argues that the U.S. has kind of progressed from very specific, very concerted legislation, and instead we've gone to sort of abstract general standards. And as we've gone to these abstract general standards, it's become more difficult to implement policy, and outside forces like interest groups are better able to go in, rush government and bureaucracy, and try to manipulate the legislation being created to fit some need for themselves. If we look at Chris Hood, he kind of poses 5 characteristics of what we would call the perfect public program. Considering if we had the perfect way to administer a public program, what would it look like? Number 1, he says, administration would be unitary. There would be one gigantic army of government marching to the same drummer, which again is everything the United States is against in terms of its government. But you can see where that would probably make things significantly easier. Number 2, the norms and rules of administration would be uniform throughout the organization, so everybody would understand. 3, no resistance to commands. If it comes from above, we simply do what is told. 4, perfect information and communication within the organization. And 5, there would be adequate time to do these things. Unfortunately, at least one of these, if not many, 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 many more, is typically missing from every public agency that we encounter today. So what are these missing conditions? If we start by looking at organizational disunity, most governmental organizations have both a central office and a field staff, and that creates a problem automatically. You have a central office making decisions and then having to pass that information on to a field staff, which means information is inherently going to be lost. The field staff, for multiple reasons, may not listen to what the central office says. First of all, there may be capture. If I'm a field rep working in Oklahoma after a tornado goes through, I may get very clear direction from FEMA and DC. But I've been captured by the fact that I am working with the citizens. There may be sympathy, empathy, frequent contact, genuine devotion. And as a result, if what the central office tells me to do goes against what's in the best interest of these people I'm working with, I simply may just not follow. And then second, it's hard to follow all the directives. the central office passes out missives, and it's very easy for me to write out the letter that says, I want you to do X, but you're the one who actually has to do it. This is the equivalent of, it would be very easy for me to send you guys an email and say, oh, I've moved up the date of your final 2 weeks. It's going to be tomorrow. And for me, there's no stress, no problem. For you guys, it's going to be hell on earth. You're going to revolt. You're going to kill me probably. Standard operating procedures. Standard operating procedures are great because they reduce the amount of time we spend formulating responses to standardized questions. So if we know what the question is going to be or the issue, an SOP allows us to not really think about it and just go forth and do what we want. But it also presents a barrier. And that main barrier is the fact that it slows things down in the sense that whenever something new comes in, we have to spend significant amounts of time looking for what we want the SOP to be. And formulating a good SOP, and it removes the individuality of the case. We try to answer everything with the broadest stroke possible instead of giving potentially necessary one-on-one information that would be more beneficial to an individual. We need to design good programs and administer organizations that are willing to consistently reassess their goals and reassess the methods they use to reach them, and don't just rely on an SOP. The fact is, SOPs will typically end up giving us either an inappropriate or delayed response to a crisis. If it is a true crisis situation, the SOPs will either not fit and we'll apply them anyways, or at that point we'll have to figure out what the proper SOP is. So what's the solution? If you ask, government workers, the solution is every time you create a new organization, every time you create a new program, you create a new organization to administer it that will create its own SOPs, as opposed to asking an existing organization to switch its attitudes, beliefs, or life cycle. And again, that's asking a lot. And it's also, whenever we create a new organization for every new program, dramatically increasing the size, scope, and cost of government. Organizational communication can be an issue for implementing policy. The fact of the matter is, information is typically concentrated at the bottom of an organization, and information gets passed to the top through what we call selective distortion. At each stage of message transmit, the individuals try to pass on only the bits of the information that they think the person above them will want. So you may start with 100 pieces of information at the bottom, and by the time it hits your CEO, you're only passing on 3 pieces of information. And that leader at the top may simply need more than that. The more that an organization has individuals with a common technical or professional background and a flatter design, fewer levels of information, the less likely distortion is to occur. And the other problem you always have to be worried about with communication in organizations is secrecy, where people are there for the wrong reasons and they're simply not telling something. Or the government is trying not to tell something. You look at defense, secrecy is important. Not everybody has the same clearance level that works in the same agency. And as a result, they may not get the full picture or the full story, and that may cause problems moving forward. There are also problems with timing. There are 2 types of timing issues. The first being linear. Responses lag behind the issue. So we see the issue, we argue and debate it for 6 months, and then we pass some piece of legislation creating a policy or program to curb the issue. Unfortunately, within that 6 months, the fundamental nature of the issue has changed, and as a result, our policy or program is not going to successfully prove to be able to solve whatever issue we're looking at. And again, government's done that a lot, including on demographic changes, where we just don't see the cycle and we respond too late. By the time we make a response, things have either changed in a different way or changed back to where they were. And other time problems are cyclical. And with cyclical time problems, the delay in acting contributes to the persistence and severity. You want to make sure that you're not getting into this type of situation. And then lastly, we have what we call horseshoe nail problems. Incomplete or inaccurate planning when we create new policies and programs. One of the great examples here, we had lots of national legislation that was requiring coal mines to be inspected. And then there was never enabling legislation to actually fund the hiring of these inspectors. And we learned about that, of course, when the mines started collapsing and Pennsylvania, West Virginia, when we saw what was happening internationally in Chile. Or you can look at the Affordable Care Act website, which is getting lots of attention these days. That was a huge problem for the federal government and for President Obama. And the reason it became such a huge problem is it was poor planning. Nobody thought to run through it and see if it was actually working. We have interorganizational politics. We have what we call clearance points. Aaron Wildavsky and Jeff Pressman, in their study of Oakland, talk about this idea of a clearance point, which are the number of individual decision points that must be agreed to before any policy intentions can be translated into action. Now, basically, if we want to view this from a statistical standpoint, it's a question of exponents. One would expect that each decision point is independent of the others, and say that we say the probability of an individual decision maker agreeing to the program is 90%. If that's the case, and there are 3 leaders we have to agree, there is a 73% chance total that this policy or program is going to be agreed to. And 73% we get from doing 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9. 0.9 times 0.9 would be 2 clearance points. It would be an 81% chance of success. Add in a third and it becomes 73%. So if we had 2 leaders and a 50% chance of clearance for each, the overall chance of the program clearing would then be 25%, 0.5 times 0.5. And again, we'll talk about this when I'm back to make sure we all understand how this works. And it's not that it's always going to be the same odds of clearance for an individual. It may be 90% and 10%. Just sort of depends. We have issues with vertical structures implementing it. We may have partisan politics. We may just have different political parties at different levels of government. So it's a Democratic federal government in a state that is conservative and red, and the state simply says, we don't want to implement this, we're going to do it our way, yada, yada, yada. The state's local governments may lack the resources they need to actually implement the policies. If it comes down as a mandate and there's not money attached to it, the states may not do a very good job of implementing the policy because they can't afford to. And then we also have the private sector entering the picture and trying to figure out, in terms of the different levels of government, where do they really fit, or where do they fit best? And then at the same time, we have horizontal structure issues. Horizontal structure issues include things like trying to coordinate across the same level of government. If you consider, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services, they both deal with WIC, which is, Women, Infants, and Children's Nutrition. Both of them, 2 federal government agencies, big departments, trying to work together on one issue, there are going to be coordination problems. There may be language and encoding difficulties where 2 groups don't really speak the same language to one another, and as a result, it's always 2 ships passing in the night. Or there just may be conflict. There may be turf battles, there may be groups digging their feet in, trying to protect what they've always done, or what they've always thought they should be doing. And when that happens, we obviously run into huge issues as well. In the future, where are we going to go with this? Because again, implementation at the organizational level is really the key to public policy. And that's important. It becomes extremely important that we try to figure out how we can best assure successful implementation. We can't get mad at, legislators for passing bad policy when we're not doing a good job of implementing the policy that they pass. And that's hard to convince people. So that's something to always be considered. We could go from the bottom up. One perspective, of course, like we talked about earlier, is that implementation goes from the top down. Basically saying that federal government, top level, makes the decisions, they pass it down through the bureaucracy and through other levels of government, and people do what they say. But many argue that it'd be easier if we go bottom up, where basically if at the bottom level we backward mapped and considered the interests of the lower echelons of the bureaucracy. So if we started where it would be implemented, we could then get to a more meaningful policy because the individuals tasked with actually carrying it out have sat and told us that they think this is workable. They think this is a good idea. Now, of course, if we do that, implementation will be easier, and we're not assured that easy implementation is actually better. Sometimes we learn lots about a policy or a problem by going through the implementation battle and having to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And in general, it's just the question of, do we want this sort of third-generation understanding where we add layers of complexity to how we implement policy, as opposed to worrying about simply getting something done or trying to make it as streamlined as possible. Sometimes maybe we need to have the battles that happen within organizations and between organizations while we try to implement some policy passed by some various legislative body.